everyone. Raise your hand if you ever felt the need to hide something before. Something that made you different from everyone else. A difference that follows you around wherever you go, and even introduces itself to others before you can even speak. But now imagine if you had to carry this thing like it was on your skin for the rest of your life. This was my reality. My name is Ashna Patel, and when I was 6 years old, I was diagnosed with vitiligo, a condition that causes the skin to lose its pigment in patches. And while my condition was my reason to make myself almost invisible, I've realized how everyone has their own version of this. You see, speaking out often feels difficult, especially when you have a condition like vitiligo. But even when it's not your fault, how you respond is still up to you, which is why the most powerful decision you can make is simply choosing to be seen. So when I was diagnosed, I wanted my condition to be a secret, except it quickly became a secret that everyone knew. Most people pick their outfits based off the weather. I picked mine based off my spots. I wore long sleeves in the summer to hide my pale elbows, and I resisted the urge to roll them up when it got too hot. Now, being only 6 years old when I was diagnosed, I never knew much about my condition, but I made it my mission to never learn, because learning about it would have made it feel too real. And so I thought that if I simply ignored it, it wouldn't define me. But I only now realize how much power I gave my condition when the rude comments really started to stick. When kids at school would ask me if I was ever going to spread it to them, I would hear them whispering off in the corner, calling me dirty for not washing it off. And so I went through years of phototherapy treatments. I tried various ointments and creams in any attempt to repigment my skin. And again, it's only now that I realize I never was fully in control. You see, my condition, it chose what I wore, it chose what I said, it chose how I said it, it chose how I behaved. But above all of that, it decided who I was before I even had the chance to do so. But I also remember the day I felt everything change. I was packing up at the end of dance practice, and I noticed my mom's friend was holding something in her hand. She handed me a book that was titled Ballerina Dreams, and it told the story of Michaela DePrince, a ballerina with vitiligo. And as I flipped through the pages, I watched as she quietly handed each girl a copy, but she didn't say anything. When she came back around to me, I smiled, I thanked her, and I went home. Now, the change I mentioned earlier didn't come from seeing vitiligo written about in a book, but rather, it came from the silent understanding my friend's mom had offered me by acknowledging my difference. She never called me out, nor did I ever have to ask her to do so. And now seeing this made me realize how I could teach others about vitiligo without having to stand in front of them and answer awkward questions. But I knew, in order to do this, I first had to stop hiding and speak out. However, speaking out often feels dangerous, especially when you have a condition like vitiligo, because it's your instinct to shrink and just let the topic go. And it's also something many psychologists have talked about. At the World Vitiligo Conference I attended this last summer, I listened as a psychologist explained how teenagers who especially suffer with very physical vitiligo often never share their story. Now, I later asked him why this was the case, and he told me that when these people feel this way, they stop seeing their story as something worth sharing. And now hearing this made me realize why the sense of community I had found and created was so important. Because in a room full of people who I knew could understand my experience, there was no longer that initial risk of sharing my story. But now if you saw me today, you probably wouldn't guess I had vitiligo. And this is because I've had a lot of repigmentation over the years. But I've also had people ask me why I still care so much about, spreading awareness about the condition, as if it had stopped mattering just because it's less visible now. But the truth is, I never always looked like this. I still remember what it felt like to tug at every article of clothing in any attempt to cover more of my skin. I remember what it felt like when I ducked out of group photos because I didn't want to draw attention to myself. But beyond that, I still continue to talk about the condition because, as a quote from one of my favorite movies, The Fantastic Mr. Fox, I know what it's like to feel different, and I also know many of my mentors who feel the same way. They too once struggled to share their voice, but now they do so boldly. It brings me back to a conversation I had with the famous model, Winnie Harlow. Now, we got to talk about a few things that had been on my mind, one of which was I asked her, Winnie, do people ever assume it's easier for you now that they see you on the cover of everything? And she smiled and said something along the lines of, being seen isn't always easy, but you did choose to do it anyway. And hearing this really stuck with me, because that's all my journey has ever been about. It was not about visibility for the sake of it. It was not about vitiligo advocacy for the sake of it. But rather, it was about keeping that initial promise and choice I had made to myself years ago to speak out, and that future promise I continue to make to others who are still afraid to do so. So once I started finally, speaking out, I saw myself reaching for many more opportunities. I went out of my way to meet people who had the same condition as me and got to build my own little community. But now I saw how they helped me in ways I could never explain, but I could also help them with their self-confidence and being true in their own skin. So then in 2023, I decided to start my own group called Melanin Mosaic. And now my goal was to bring that understanding and the recognition that I had lacked growing up. And since then, I made it my mission to continue to educate others through art. And I've hosted many, art galleries, photo shoots, youth meetups with patients from Florida, elementary school visits where we did little painting activities. I've collaborated with global organizations to promote vitiligo research, and even got the wonderful opportunity to speak at the 2025 World Vitiligo Conference. But none of this would have been possible if I never made that initial choice. Because the truth is, it's always going to be scary to speak out, especially for a difference you didn't choose. I never chose my vitiligo, but I did choose what came after it. Because with every conversation, with every piece of art, with every speech, I remind myself of that initial promise I made, and that promise I continue to make to others. So if you're someone who also struggles with their difference, it's okay to not have it all figured out. But if there's one thing I want you all to take away from this, it's that you do have the power to change how you see yourself within your difference. And the day you make that choice is the day you'll see how everything can change. Thank you.